When a struggling widow spent her last savings on 48 old geese, the entire town laughed. Farmers called her crazy. Neighbors said she was throwing away the only money she had left. But a few months later, a devastating infestation swept across Idaho's onion fields. One farm after another began to fail, and while everyone else watched their crops disappear, the woman they mocked was about to prove that sometimes the strangest ideas become the most valuable of all. This is the incredible story of Emily Dawson and the 48 geese that changed an entire valley. A cool spring wind drifted across the onion fields outside Boise, Idaho. Under a cloudless sky, farmers throughout Treasure Valley watched nervously as reports of a destructive green pest spread from farm to farm. Emily Dawson stood alone beside a weathered fence, staring across 32 acres of onion fields that represented everything she had left in the world. At 38 years old, Emily was taller than most women in the valley, standing nearly 5 feet 9 inches with a lean, hard-working frame shaped by years of farm labor. Her chestnut brown hair was usually tied into a practical braid that rested over one shoulder, and her hazel eyes carried a quiet intelligence that often made people underestimate how stubborn she could be. The Idaho sun had left her skin lightly tanned, while the past 2 years had etched faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. 2 years earlier, her husband, Robert Dawson, had been killed in a trucking accident during a winter delivery route near Twin Falls. Robert had been a broad-shouldered man with dark hair, kind blue eyes, and a calm personality that balanced Emily's independent nature. His death had shattered her world overnight. Since then, Emily had managed every part of the farm herself. She negotiated supply contracts, repaired irrigation systems, maintained equipment, and somehow kept the property afloat despite mounting debts. The farm had little room for error. One failed harvest would likely end everything. That reality weighed heavily on Emily's mind as she walked through the young onion rows that morning. She knelt beside several plants and carefully examined the leaves. There they were again. Small green larvae. More than yesterday, she frowned. For weeks, stories had circulated throughout Treasure Valley about a new infestation spreading rapidly across local farms. The pests attacked onion crops aggressively, feeding on leaves and reducing yields. Farmers were already spending large amounts of money on pesticides, but many reported disappointing results. Emily stood and brushed dirt from her jeans. At the neighboring property, Nathan Cole's workers were preparing large chemical sprayers. Nathan Cole was 56 years old and owned one of the largest farming operations in the county. He stood over 6 feet tall with a thick frame, silver gray hair, sharp green eyes, and a neatly trimmed gray mustache. Years of success had given him confidence, though some people quietly described it as arrogance. Nathan was respected throughout the valley because his methods usually worked, and Nathan believed chemicals were the only solution. Emily wished she could afford the same approach, but she couldn't. That evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table reviewing invoices and expenses beneath the glow of a single lamp. The numbers refused to cooperate. Fertilizer costs, fuel costs, equipment repairs, property taxes. Every dollar seemed already spoken for. Then her attention drifted toward a folded newspaper advertisement she had picked up earlier that day at the feed store. Failed farm auction, 48 aged geese for sale. Lowest bid accepted. She read it again. Most people would have laughed and moved on. Emily did not. For several weeks, she had been researching alternative methods of pest control. During late nights, she had borrowed agricultural journals from the county library and studied examples from older farming communities. One article mentioned waterfowl being used to reduce insect populations naturally. The idea sounded ridiculous, yet the more she thought about it, the more it refused to leave her mind. The following morning, Emily drove her aging pickup truck nearly 40 miles to a bankrupt farm on the edge of the valley. The property looked abandoned. Broken fences leaned at odd angles. Empty feed troughs sat beneath rusting sheds. Near one enclosure stood the flock, 48 geese. The sight was not encouraging. Most were old. Their feathers looked dull and uneven. Several waddled stiffly. A few appeared partially lame. No wonder nobody wanted them. The seller was Harold Bennett, a tired-looking farmer in his 60s with thinning white hair, weathered skin, and permanently slumped shoulders. Years of financial problems seemed to have drained all optimism from his face. "You sure about this?" Harold asked. Emily looked at the geese, then at her remaining savings, then back at the geese. "I think so." Harold shook his head slowly. "Most folks are buying chemicals." Emily smiled faintly. "Most folks have more money than I do." A few hours later, the 48 geese were loaded into her trailer. The reactions began almost immediately. When Emily stopped for fuel on the drive home, 2 farmers laughed openly at the sight of her cargo. By the time she reached town, word had already started spreading. At the feed store, people whispered. At the diner, people joked. By evening, half the valley seemed aware that Emily Dawson had spent her remaining savings on 48 old geese. The next morning, Nathan Cole himself drove past her property. His truck slowed. He stared at the birds wandering inside a temporary pen. Then he laughed. "Emily," he called from the window, "you planning to raise geese or save your farm?" Several workers nearby laughed with him. Emily watched them leave. Then she looked toward the flock. The geese wandered awkwardly through the grass, completely unaware that an entire valley was already mocking them. For a brief moment, doubt crept into her mind. What if everyone was right? What if grief, stress, and desperation had clouded her judgment? But then she looked beyond the pasture toward the onion fields. The larvae were spreading, the chemicals weren't stopping them, and doing nothing guaranteed failure. Slowly, Emily folded her arms and made her decision. No matter what people thought, she would see this through. The 48 geese had arrived, and her plan was only beginning. The following weeks brought more attention than Emily Dawson had ever wanted. Every morning before sunrise, the 38-year-old widow stepped into her onion fields while the rest of Treasure Valley still slept. The cool Idaho air carried the scent of damp soil and growing crops, and for a few precious hours she could work without an audience. Her tall, lean frame moved steadily between the rows as she measured distances, carried fence posts, and rolled out bundles of low-wire mesh she had purchased with the little money she had left. The geese watched her from their temporary enclosure. The flock looked no more impressive than the day she bought them. Several birds limped slightly from age. Others had missing feathers around their necks. Their white plumage carried patches of gray and brown staining from years of neglect. Yet Emily paid attention to something few others noticed. They were constantly searching. Every spare moment their heads remained lowered toward the ground, pecking at insects, weeds, and anything edible they discovered beneath the grass. That observation became the foundation of her plan. Emily did not intend to let the geese wander freely across the farm. Instead, she spent nearly 2 weeks building a network of narrow corridors between the onion rows. The fences stood only waist-high and stretched across carefully selected sections of the field. The design looked strange from above, almost like a giant maze carved through the farm. The labor was exhausting. Many nights she returned to the farmhouse with aching shoulders and blistered hands. Yet each evening she studied agricultural notes spread across her kitchen table, making small adjustments to the layout. One afternoon, a pickup truck stopped beside the property. The driver was Earl Patterson, a 50-year-old feed supplier who serviced farms throughout the county. Earl was a stocky man with thinning blonde hair, a round face, weathered skin, and a permanent expression of curiosity. Unlike many others, he wasn't cruel. He simply enjoyed collecting local gossip. He climbed from his truck and stared at the maze. "What exactly is that supposed to be?" he asked. "A feeding system," Emily replied. "For geese, for pests." Earl blinked twice, then laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. Within 48 hours, half the valley had heard the story. The nickname appeared shortly afterward, Dawson Zoo. Somebody painted it on a piece of cardboard and nailed it beside the road one night. Emily removed the sign before sunrise, but the name remained. Soon people began arriving simply to watch. Families parked alongside the road. Teenagers leaned against fence posts. Farmers stopped tractors to stare. The attention would have embarrassed many people. It exhausted Emily. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention. Since Robert's death, she had become even more private. Grief had a way of shrinking a person's world. Most evenings she preferred the company of her dog, old farm records, and silence, but now everyone seemed fascinated by her failure before it had even happened. The geese were finally released into the first corridors near the end of May. At first the results looked disastrous. The birds wandered aimlessly. Several became confused by the fencing. One somehow managed to get stuck beneath a water trough. Another spent nearly an hour honking angrily at its own reflection in a metal bucket. The spectators loved it. Laughter echoed across the roadside almost daily. Even Emily struggled not to laugh occasionally. Yet she also noticed something important. The geese never touched the onions, not once. Instead, they focused on weeds growing between the rows and insects hidden near the base of the plants. Exactly as she had hoped. Each day she moved them into new corridors. Slowly, patterns emerged, weed growth decreased, certain insect populations became noticeably smaller, the geese grew healthier as their diet improved. Meanwhile, reports from neighboring farms became increasingly troubling. The green larvae were spreading faster than expected. Several farmers had already applied multiple rounds of pesticide. The infestations continued growing. One afternoon, Nathan Cole arrived. His black pickup truck rolled slowly along the edge of the property before stopping beside the fence. Nathan stepped out wearing his usual denim work shirt, polished boots, and broad-brimmed hat. His sharp green eyes moved across the maze of fencing and the wandering geese. Several neighboring farmers stood nearby. They were clearly waiting for his verdict. Nathan studied the field for nearly a minute. Then he smiled, not kindly. The smile of a man completely certain he understood how the story would end. Emily, he called. She approached calmly. Nathan gestured toward the geese. By September, you'll have no crop and no money. The group behind him chuckled. Nathan folded his arms. You should sell those birds while somebody's still willing to buy them. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then she looked across the onion rows where dozens of geese worked methodically beneath the leaves. I guess we'll find out, she replied. Nathan shook his head and climbed back into his truck. The spectators slowly dispersed. As the sun began setting, Emily remained alone beside the field. The geese continued searching beneath the plants. The insects continued multiplying across the valley, and somewhere deep inside, despite the ridicule, Emily felt something she had not felt for months: hope. Because for the first time since Robert's death, she was no longer reacting to problems. She was building a solution. By early July, fear had spread faster than the infestation itself across Treasure Valley. Every morning brought worse news. Entire onion fields that had looked healthy only weeks earlier now appeared scarred and dying. The green larvae had multiplied beyond anyone's expectations. Leaves were stripped bare. Growth slowed dramatically. Farmers who had invested thousands of dollars in pesticides watched helplessly as the insects continued spreading. For Emily Dawson, the disaster was impossible to ignore. Nearly every day brought another conversation about a neighboring farm in trouble. One afternoon, she stopped at Earl Patterson's feed store and immediately sensed the mood had changed. The usual jokes and laughter were gone. Instead, worried farmers gathered around coffee tables discussing crop losses. One of them was Richard Monroe, a 48-year-old onion grower whose family had farmed the valley for 3 generations. Richard was a broad-shouldered man with thinning sandy hair, rough hands, and a thick beard streaked with gray. Years of droughts, fluctuating markets, and difficult harvests had taught him resilience, but lately his face carried something new: defeat. My northern field is gone, Richard admitted quietly. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. Everyone already knew. Several others had suffered similar losses. The pesticides were becoming less effective. Chemical costs continued climbing, and every failed application pushed farms closer to financial disaster. Emily listened silently before returning home. As she drove through the valley, she noticed more abandoned sections of farmland than she had ever seen before. Fields that should have been vibrant green now appeared patchy and yellow. Some farmers had already begun plowing under damaged crops rather than spending more money trying to save them. Yet when Emily reached Dawson Farm, she found herself staring at something that still felt difficult to believe. Her onions remained healthy. Not perfect, but healthy. The rows remained green. The plants continued growing, and every day the geese worked tirelessly between them. The old flock had changed noticeably during the previous months. Their feathers looked cleaner, their movements were stronger. Many had gained weight. Most importantly, they had become remarkably efficient. Every morning, Emily guided them into new sections of the field. The birds immediately began searching beneath leaves, around roots, and through patches of weeds. Wherever they passed, insect activity declined. At first, Emily wondered whether she was imagining the results. Then she began recording data: plant height, leaf condition, pest counts, weed density. The numbers confirmed what her eyes were already telling her. The system was working. Word began spreading. People who had once stopped to laugh now stopped to observe. Pickup trucks frequently appeared along the roadside. Visitors stared across the fields in disbelief. Even Nathan Cole drove by several times without making any comments. For the first time, uncertainty had entered his expression. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled across the valley during the second week of July. The rain arrived suddenly, and it refused to stop. For 3 straight days, heavy storms soaked the region. Normally, rain would have been welcome. This time, it became a catastrophe. Emily watched helplessly from her porch as water pooled throughout the property. Strong winds battered the mesh corridors she had spent weeks building. Fence posts loosened. Sections collapsed. Entire stretches of netting were torn apart. On the 4th morning, the damage became clear. Her carefully designed feeding system no longer existed. The maze that guided the geese through the onion fields had been destroyed. Emily walked through the mud, examining the wreckage. Broken posts lay scattered everywhere. Tangling wire hung between plants. Months of work had vanished almost overnight. A knot formed in her stomach. Without the corridors, the geese could wander anywhere. The entire system depended on controlled movement. Without structure, the birds might spread across the farm randomly. Critical areas could become neglected. Pest populations might recover, and harvest was only weeks away. The timing could not have been worse. As Emily worked through the rain-soaked debris, another problem appeared. The geese had already escaped into multiple sections of the property. Small groups wandered through distant fields. Others gathered near irrigation ditches. Several disappeared beyond a line of cottonwood trees near the western fence. For the first time in months, genuine panic began creeping into Emily's mind. She had survived ridicule. She had survived financial pressure. But this felt different. The harvest was close enough to see, and now everything seemed in danger of slipping away. That evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table studying maps of the farm. Outside, the remaining rain tapped softly against the windows. The silence felt heavy. She thought about Robert, about the loans, about the years of struggle, about the people still waiting for her to fail. Part of her wanted to give up. Part of her wondered whether Nathan had been right all along. Then she looked through the window. Even in the fading light, she could see several geese moving slowly through the onion rows. Still searching, still working, still doing exactly what they had done every day since arriving. Emily stared at them for a long moment. The corridors were gone, the harvest was approaching, and somehow she would have to find a new solution before everything she had built disappeared with them. The morning after the storm, Emily Dawson stepped onto her porch before sunrise and listened. The usual sounds of the farm seemed different. The damaged fencing still lay scattered across the property. Bent posts protruded from the mud like broken bones. Torn mesh hung from onion plants. Weeks earlier, the sight would have devastated her completely. Now something else caught her attention. The geese, she could hear them, not randomly scattered, together. Emily hurried toward the eastern field where a cluster of the birds had gathered near an irrigation ditch. As she approached, several geese lifted their heads and immediately turned toward her. Without thinking, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small brass handbell. The bell had once belonged to Robert. For months she had used it to signal feeding time and move the flock between sections of the farm. She rang it once. A clear metallic tone drifted across the field. To her surprise, the geese began walking toward her almost immediately. Emily froze. Then she rang it again. The response became even more obvious. The birds followed. A slow smile appeared across her face. For months she had focused on the fencing system. She had never realized the flock had been learning something far more valuable. They knew her signal. That afternoon she spent hours testing the idea. Each time she rang the bell, the geese adjusted their direction. Each time she changed location, they followed. By sunset, a new possibility had begun forming in her mind. Maybe the corridors had never been the most important part of the system. Maybe the flock itself had become the system. The following morning, Emily began experimenting. Instead of rebuilding the damaged maze, she guided the entire flock through one section of onions using only the bell. The results exceeded every expectation. The birds moved as a group. They searched methodically beneath leaves. They spread naturally through the rows while remaining close enough to respond whenever she changed direction. The process required more walking from Emily, but it also allowed greater flexibility. For the first time, she could direct the flock exactly where pest activity appeared highest. Within days, the routine became remarkably efficient. Every morning shortly after sunrise, Emily walked through the fields carrying the brass bell. The geese followed. Every evening before sunset, she repeated the process. The flock moved almost like a single living machine. Visitors soon noticed, so did the valley. One afternoon, a local newspaper reporter arrived. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, a 34-year-old journalist from Boise with shoulder-length black hair, sharp brown eyes, and a reputation for chasing unusual agricultural stories. Rebecca possessed an observant personality and rarely accepted rumors without seeing evidence herself. Years earlier, she had built her career by exposing fraudulent farming schemes, which made her naturally skeptical of anything that sounded too miraculous. When she first arrived, she expected another amusing story. Instead, she spent 3 hours watching. She watched Emily ring the bell. She watched 48 geese move together across the field. She watched them search through weeds and insects without damaging the onions. Most importantly, she compared Emily's fields to neighboring farms. The difference was impossible to ignore. While many properties now displayed yellowing leaves and visible pest damage, Dawson Farm remained surprisingly healthy. Rebecca filled several pages of notes. The article appeared 4 days later. The headline attracted attention throughout Treasure Valley. The Woman with the Geese. For the first time, the story was no longer being told as a joke. People became curious. Farmers who had mocked Emily now stopped beside the road and watched silently. Some even brought notebooks. Nathan Cole remained among the skeptics, but his confidence appeared weaker than before. His own fields were suffering, not disastrously, not yet, but enough to concern him. Meanwhile, the onions at Dawson Farm continued growing. The geese continued working, and the harvest drew closer. By August, large sections of the valley displayed visible signs of damage. Many farmers had accepted significant losses. Some would be lucky to recover their expenses. Yet Dawson Farm remained green. Healthy rows stretched across the property almost unchanged. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One evening, Emily stood beside the western fence watching the setting sun paint the valley gold. Several vehicles sat parked along the roadside. Their owners weren't laughing anymore. Nobody pointed. Nobody made jokes. They simply watched. Months earlier, they had come expecting entertainment. Now they came searching for answers, and for the first time since beginning her strange experiment, Emily realized something important. The valley was no longer waiting for her to fail. The valley was beginning to learn. September arrived with cool mornings, golden sunlight, and a silence that felt very different from the tension that had dominated Treasure Valley only months earlier. Across much of the region, farmers faced difficult calculations. Harvest crews moved through damaged onion fields, collecting smaller yields than expected. Storage sheds that should have been overflowing stood half empty. Many families were already discussing loans, delayed equipment purchases, and how they would survive the coming winter. But on Dawson Farm, the season had unfolded differently. Emily Dawson stood near the edge of her property one morning watching workers load freshly harvested onions into wooden bins. At 38 years old, she still carried the same quiet determination that had sustained her through years of hardship. Her chestnut-brown braid hung over one shoulder, and the faint lines around her hazel eyes seemed softer now than they had been in years. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt something unfamiliar. Relief. The harvest numbers continued exceeding expectations. Not only had the crop survived, but much of it ranked among the highest quality onions produced anywhere in the valley that year. The reason quickly became obvious. While neighboring farms had suffered severe pest damage, Dawson Farm had maintained healthy plants throughout the growing season. The onions reached maturity with stronger foliage and larger bulbs than many agricultural experts believed possible under such difficult conditions. The market reacted immediately. Supply shortages pushed onion prices higher than anyone had predicted. Buyers competed aggressively for available inventory. Within weeks, Emily sold nearly her entire harvest at prices that local farmers had not seen in many years. For the first time since Robert's accident, every outstanding bill on the farm was paid, every loan installment, every supplier invoice, every overdue repair. That evening, Emily sat on the porch of her small farmhouse and watched the geese wander peacefully through the pasture. The flock looked older than ever, yet she knew none of this would have happened without them. The same birds everyone had mocked had become the most valuable investment she had ever made. News of her success spread quickly. By October, Dawson Farm had become one of the most discussed properties in Idaho agriculture. The biggest moment came during the annual Treasure Valley Agricultural Fair. Farmers, suppliers, researchers, and county officials gathered from across the region. Emily attended reluctantly. She had never enjoyed public attention. What surprised her most was who approached her first: Nathan Cole. The large farmer who had predicted her failure months earlier walked slowly across the exhibition grounds toward her. Nathan looked older than she remembered. The difficult season had left visible strain on his face. His silver-gray hair seemed thinner. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance had softened considerably. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Nathan extended his hand. "I was wrong." The words were simple, but everyone nearby heard them. Nathan looked directly at her. "I laughed at you. Most of us did." He paused. "Turns out you saw something the rest of us missed." The surrounding crowd fell silent. Emily shook his hand. "There wasn't much to see at first," she said quietly. Nathan smiled. "Maybe that's why we missed it." The moment became one of the most talked-about events of the fair, yet what happened afterward proved even more important. During the following spring, farmers began visiting Dawson Farm not to mock her but to learn. Pickup trucks lined the road almost every weekend. Emily answered questions. She demonstrated how she managed the geese. She shared records, observations, and mistakes. Among the visitors were agricultural researchers who documented her results and encouraged further study. Within 2 years, dozens of farms throughout the valley had adopted variations of her approach. Not every farm used geese exactly the same way. Some modified the system. Others combined it with different pest control methods, but the principle remained. Nature could sometimes solve problems that expensive chemicals could not. Years passed. Treasure Valley recovered. New challenges arrived. New farming methods emerged. Life moved forward. Emily never became wealthy or famous. She continued living in the same modest farmhouse overlooking the fields. She still woke before sunrise. She still preferred hard work over attention. The geese gradually grew old and disappeared one by one, yet their legacy remained. Long afterward, whenever people discussed the devastating infestation of 1987, the story always returned. They remembered the widow everyone laughed at. They remembered the old geese nobody wanted. And they remembered how an entire valley learned that wisdom sometimes arrives from the most unexpected places. Because when every conventional solution failed, it was not money, technology, or reputation that saved Dawson Farm. It was the courage of one woman willing to trust an idea that nobody else believed in. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive in the ways we expect. They do not always come through wealth, power, advanced technology, or the solutions everyone else believes are correct. Sometimes God places an idea in the heart of an ordinary person and asks them to have the courage to follow it. When Emily Dawson stood alone against an entire community, she had no guarantee of success. She only had faith, perseverance, and the willingness to keep moving forward when everyone else believed she would fail. And perhaps that is how many miracles begin, not with certainty, but with obedience, patience, and trust. In our everyday lives, many of us face situations that feel impossible: financial struggles, health problems, family hardships, seasons where it seems like every door is closing. During those moments, it is easy to listen to fear, doubt, and the voices telling us to give up. But this story reminds us that God can use the most unexpected people, the most unlikely ideas, and even the things the world considers worthless to accomplish something extraordinary. So if you are going through a difficult season today, do not lose hope. Keep planting the seeds God has placed in your heart. Keep working, keep believing. The harvest may take longer than you expect, but God is often working long before we can see the results. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what lesson you learned from Emily's journey. And if you enjoy stories of faith, perseverance, and hope, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every challenge you are facing. May He give you strength when you feel weak, wisdom when you feel uncertain, and peace when the road ahead seems unclear. Thank you for watching, and may God watch over you always.